Well, I think I'll just go ahead and get started since it's 12:05. Um, so this will be like a pretty broad overview on K-12 funding. And some of this might be familiar and some of it might not be, but I'm gonna go through it all anyways since we are recording it. But in Montana, we have multiple entities that share governance of K-12 education. So we have the legislature, which provides the system of public schools and funds the state's share and distributes it in an equitable manner. We have the superintendent, of course, with duties in law, and who also serves as a non-voting member on the Board of Public Ed. Then, of course, we have the Board of Public Education, who has the general supervision over the school system. And at the local level, the school district trustees, and that have the board of each school board and board of trustees that are elected as provided by law. And so there is a kind of a local control element at the local level. School funding is constitutionally required in Montana. That's Article 10, Part 10, Section 1 of the Constitution. And so here in bold is some of the kind of key language in the Montana Constitution, that it is the goal of the people to establish a system of education which will develop the full educational potential of each person, and equality of educational opportunity is guaranteed to each person of the state. The second subsection references the, kind of a Native American heritage and the state's commitment to educational goals related to that. And then third is really laying out the legislature's role in school funding, where the legislature, the language says it, but that's really referencing the legislature, shall fund and distribute in an equitable manner to the school districts the state share of the cost of the basic elementary and secondary school system. And so here we have references to both equality of education opportunity and equitable distribution of funds. And then in state law, we actually have the funding formula itself, that is, was established in response to this constitutional language. And the only entity that can modify this funding formula is the Montana legislature. So when we talk about equality and equity in education, there are a bunch of different graphics that kind of show the differences. I think there are some arguments being made on, on different aspects that certain graphics include or don't include, but I think this is a great way to get at equality versus equity. And so in our right-hand picture, we have a more equitable distribution of resources in order to provide equality of opportunity. And so in Montana's funding formula, the resources are allocated based on need in varying amounts to reflect two realities. You have children and schools or districts requiring different amounts of resources, and then districts that have varying capacities to generate revenue. And so the Montana funding formula takes both of these kinds of need into account in our funding system. So here we have a list of court cases and changes to K-12 finance. In 1989 and 1992, we had a couple of equity lawsuits. And in response to those lawsuits, the formula was changed. You can see on the far right column, the kind of total 95 mills were established in 1989, based off some mills prior that were used for equalization. And then in 1992, a GTB component was added for debt service. And then in the early 2000s, we had the adequacy lawsuits, where a couple other funding components were added to the funding system, including 4 of the fully state-funded components, which were added in 2005 in a special session that followed the lawsuit, and then in 2008, an increase in the GTB ratio and some additional funding for facilities. So now we'll switch gears a little bit from the background information to talking a little bit about property taxes. I don't want to hit property taxes too heavily since we've done a couple property tax lunch and learns. But in order to oh, go ahead.
No, I was just acknowledging.
Okay. Yeah, in order to understand the school funding system and how it interacts with property taxes, understanding how property taxes are calculated is kind of critical. And so basically, we take the assessed value of a property, we multiply it by a tax rate, and those tax rates differ in statute, and then we multiply by a number of mills. And so this just walks through an example calculation. If you have a home that's worth $300,000 and you have 95 mills, you take the $300,000 assessed value, multiply it by 1.35, which is the tax rate that is set for residential property in statute that is controlled by the legislature, and that gets your taxable value. Then we take the taxable value and divide it by 1,000 to get the value of a mill, and then multiply by the number of mills, in this case 95, to get our total tax liability. So here we'll dive into the different funding sources for K-12 education. We have 3 different levels: federal, state, and local, and we'll talk about the federal sources first. It's about 13% of revenue. That was as of fiscal year 2022, and that was excluding COVID funds just because they were a one-time source of funding from the federal government. We have impact aid, which is federal funding for federally connected children whose families work on non-taxable federal land. So that includes tribal land, Forest Service land, the parks, etc. That was about 67 million in fiscal 22. We have some school food funding, which is exactly what it sounds like, provides school lunches. That's through the USDA. And that was 88 million in fiscal year 2022. It was unusually high in response to the COVID pandemic, although the funds weren't specifically COVID related. So I think it's a little bit lower now that mechanism has expired. We have IDEA funding, which is for individuals with disabilities. And that was about 38 million in fiscal year 2022. And then the Title I funding, which is federal funding for schools with a lot of lower income students. And that was $61 million in fiscal year 2022. And so given that that's only 13% of the funding, the main pieces that we're going to hit are state and local. In 2022, it was about 41% of K-12 revenue that came from state sources. And despite the fact that we didn't have the kind of same funding structure in fiscal year 2022, the amounts are about the same. So from the state, we have 3 different main accounts that fund K-12 education. We have the guarantee account, which we consider to be the first source of school funding in terms of appropriations. The pattern of payments don't necessarily follow this kind of first, second, and third source pattern. But the guarantee account receives earning off the Common School Permanent Trust and then the revenue generated on Common School Trust lands. And it's a statutory appropriation. It's approximately $50 million. It ranges sometimes between, 46 million and 56 million. We actually are on the higher end this year of closer to the $56 million mark than we have been in the past. And there is kind of a cap in statute that of any revenue in that account above 56 million goes to major maintenance for school facilities. And so we actually hit that cap this year. And that will take effect in fiscal year 2025, that some of that additional funding will go to the schools for major maintenance projects. Then our second source, again, in terms of appropriation, is a new account, which was established in 2023, which is the School Equalization and Property Tax Reduction Account, or the SEPTR, which receives the revenue from the 95 mills. And then that funding is allocated back to the school districts through the state funding formula. And this is the piece of the formula, at least from the state side, that's new. The 95 mills used to go into the general fund, but as of July 1st, 2023, they now go into this account.
Right.
Um, and then our third source, of course, is kind of the backfill. Whatever is not funded by the guarantee account or the scepter is filled in with state general fund. And which again used to receive the 95 mils, but no longer does. And that appropriation, it's about 500 million, depends year to year how much comes in from the guarantee account and the scepter account. And so the scepter account and the state general fund are appropriated in House Bill 2. Um, so the guarantee account is statutory, but the other two are appropriated in House Bill 2. And that's actually something that we can see. And I think I have a screenshot later on here that shows that. But first, we'll walk a little bit through kind of the funding mechanisms for the guarantee account. This is our guarantee account brochure. It's actually put together, I believe, by Sam Schaefer in our office. And so it kind of shows the cash flow for how we get to the final guarantee account number. I'd actually be kind of interested to see what it looks like for fiscal year 2024. You can see in fiscal year 2023, we had about $54 million in the guarantee account. This year was, again, more. So the next piece that we have is the scepter account. And I have the statute on the 95 mils here, which are actually the 33, 22, and 40 mils that we combine into the 95. But I show here where you can find this in House Bill 2. So if you're looking under the OPI appropriation and you see the line that for K-12 base aid, the state special revenue amount here, $426 million for fiscal year 2024, is from the 95 mils from the scepter account. That's the entirety of the 95 mils. I think there are some misconceptions that the entire amount of 95 mil revenue doesn't go to schools, and that's not true. The entire amount goes to schools and then some, of course, with the general fund appropriation here.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are some mechanisms in statute for how increases to the 95 mils affect school funding. So we created this scepter account. That portion of the law was in effect as of July 1st, 2023. But there's a second piece to this law where 55% of any increased revenue is used to reduce local property taxes. And so this was done in an attempt to kind of maintain a balance between property tax and other taxes in the state general fund, which are largely income tax in funding K-12 education. So this portion of the law goes into effect in fiscal year 2025. So will affect tax bills in November this year. And the amount for fiscal year 2025 was kind of hard coded into the bill at $33 million. Once we get to fiscal year 2026, there's an automatic calculation, we're calling it a dial, that kind of takes care of this calculation. But basically, 55% of the increase in the 95 mils will first go to increasing countywide school retirement GTB, which will lower county property taxes for retirement. And once that reaches kind of a capped amount, it's about a 70-30 split in statute. The additional revenue from the 95 mils will overflow into the major maintenance aid payment to lower school district property taxes for major maintenance projects. And then finally, there's another overflow that will increase debt service assistance for in order to lower school district property taxes. And so I think between those three mechanisms, the formula is expected to cap out sometime in the late 2030s. But until that happens, every year additional money will be going towards either the GTB mechanism or the mechanisms that are GTB-like for major maintenance aid and debt service assistance.
Sure.
But there's another piece of this law that we don't talk about a lot because we don't generally anticipate a reduction in revenue, although that theoretically could happen either by reducing mills or if values decrease statewide in Montana. And so if there's a reduction in revenue brought in by the 95 mills, not necessarily a reduction in mills, but if it's enough of a reduction to reduce the revenue amount, then the base GTB and the countywide retirement GTB are dialed all the way back, the full amount of the decrease, and that shifts the costs back onto the local taxpayers. And so what this really does is help maintain a balance between not only property tax and income tax, but also state and local funding for K-12 education. And historically in Montana, when we've had budget shortfalls, the K-12 costs have shifted more onto local taxpayers than the state. And so, again, I think that can draw up some questions about whether or not we're distributing K-12 funding in an equitable manner. So these bar charts really just illustrate what will happen with the SEPTA account for fiscal year 2024 and 2025. You can see in 2024, we have an increase in the 95 mils. That's that kind of periwinkle color. And that decreases the amount of state general fund, which is in green. But then essentially we have a couple things going on here, not just the SEPTA account, but we have a lag in our GTB formula. It's based on prior year taxable values. And so when these taxable values are caught up, so in fiscal year 2025, because our jump in taxable value happened in 2024, this actually will increase the GTB payment and therefore decrease local levies by about $20 million. And that $20 million is really comparing to fiscal year 2023 before the lag occurred, because it was about a $10 million reduction from 23 to 24, and then a $30 million increase from 24 to 25. But it's kind of net, if you kind of ignore the blip in 24, it's about a $20 million increase. And then what we see is House Bill 587 kicking in, where it's not really making an effect in the district general fund, but is actually affecting the retirement fund, because the district general fund GTB is capped out. And so House Bill 587 is really designed to first affect retirement and then major maintenance aid and then debt service assistance. And so you'll see in the retirement fund column, the green amount, which is coming from the state general fund, is actually being bumped up due to House Bill 587. And it's decreasing local levies, which are in kind of the burnt orange color, by about $33 million. And so the way you can think of this is really kind of an overflow. When we've capped out the district general fund, the remaining income tax bumps over into the retirement fund. But it's a result of an increase in revenue from the 95 mils. And so, again, we kind of talked about the guarantee account and then the SEPTA account. And finally, we have a huge portion of state or of school funding that's coming from the state general fund, which again is primarily income tax. And so it's about $450 million for fiscal year 2024. If we look at House Bill 2, you can see that amount right next to the state special revenue amount coming from the 95 mils, but that's the additional amount of state general fund that's needed to make up the state's portion of funding for K-12 education. So those are the three big state pieces. Next, we'll move on to the local pieces. Again, this is about 42% of revenue, excluding the bump that we got from COVID from the federal government. But the largest source of local revenue is local property tax levies. That includes required levies, voted levies, and permissive or non-voted levies. And there are also a couple of levies that are collected by the counties rather than the local school districts, and those are levies for retirement and certain transportation costs.
Right.
We also have non-levy revenue. It's not a huge portion of the total on a statewide basis, but for certain districts, it's a huge component of their funding. We also have some tuition payments, which again are bigger players for specific districts. And then finally, we have fund balance reappropriated, which is exactly what it sounds like, the amount from the prior year that's left over. There are some caps so that it can't be an unlimited amount, but they can roll over from the prior year into the current year. And so really, we've talked a lot about funding sources. Really what this is getting to is the funding formula itself and the district general fund. So we have OPI taking the state and federal funding and distributing it to school districts over the course of the year using the school funding formula, which is primarily referring to the district general fund. And so there are about 400 school districts, roughly 150,000 kids. And in school funding, we use, rather than number of students or an enrollment, a specific enrollment amount, we use an enrollment metric called average number belonging, which is different. It's mostly equivalent to enrollment. There is a 3-year averaging effect where districts that are experiencing declining enrollment get to use a 3-year average of their enrollment rather than the actual enrollment amount. And that's just designed to provide kind of a soft landing for school districts that do have declining enrollment, or say have a year where enrollment declines, like a COVID year, but then enrollment recovers. And that way they don't have to necessarily fire a number of teachers and then rehire back if they have a blip in enrollment.
Right.
So I've mentioned GTB earlier when we were talking about the SEPTA account, but I have a couple of slides here that go over what GTB, or guaranteed tax-based aid, actually is. And it's a way to equalize revenue generating capacity by providing a state subsidy for certain districts that have less property tax wealth. And it's based on their revenue generating capacity. So really what we have here are some kind of hypothetical school districts, and their revenue generating capacity is shown in green. And so you have districts like A, I, and J, which have a high revenue generating capacity. These can be our districts like Ennis, which has the Yellowstone Club as part of their tax base, even Big Sky, which doesn't have the Yellowstone Club as part of the tax base, but has a lot of high value. There are some districts in eastern Montana with a lot of natural resource wealth that don't receive GTB. And so those are our kind of more taxable value wealthy districts. You also have some districts more like C through G that have smaller revenue generating capacities. Superior, which is in Mineral County, comes to mind. They have a lot of federal Forest Service land and very minimal taxable land in their district. And so they look more like the districts in the middle. And so we're really measuring revenue generating capacity as a ratio of the district's property wealth, their taxable value, to the funding needs and costs for the district, which we consider to be our GTB area. And then, we've talked about changing the GTB ratio. When the GTB ratio increases, that guaranteed amount line increases as well. And so it can make certain districts like B and H eligible for GTB when they weren't previously, and it will increase the GTB amount received by the other districts that are already receiving it. And so I think, to put it in context, we have an example that shows a couple of districts. I mentioned Ennis and I mentioned Superior. But basically, these two districts have relatively comparable enrollment. Ennis has a few more students than Superior. But again, relatively comparable. They have vastly different taxable value wealth. If you look at Ennis, they have about $191 million of taxable value versus Superior having $5 million. And so in the GTB column, you can actually see the amount that they're getting from the state, $0 for Ennis and about $800,000 for Superior. So when we add the GTB with their base levy revenue, they're getting a comparable amount. It's a little bit less for Superior, but about $1 million a piece. And so the final column shows the number of mills. In order for the base levy revenue amount of $1.2 million to be raised for Ennis and $249,000 to be raised for Superior, they still have very different mills. 6 mills for Ennis, 48 mills for Superior. And that's just due to their tax bases, the difference in the tax bases for these districts. So next we have a hypothetical example of what it would take to raise exactly $1 million for these two districts without GTB. And, again, so here, this is hypothetical. The GTB column 0, the levy revenue is 1 million. Based on their mill values, it would take Ennis only 5 mills to raise $1 million, whereas Superior takes 192. And so what GTB aid is really doing is equalizing the tax burden for education between these two areas, so that, again, the mills aren't exactly equal in the first example, but they're a lot more on par than if we didn't have GTB aid.
Right.
So GTB is only a portion of the state funding for K-12 education. And when we talk about the school funding formula, really we talk about the district general fund. We have a state general fund, we have a school district general fund, and the school district general fund is really what we mean by the school funding formula. And so there are two pieces to this formula, one that establishes budget limits. So we have a base and a maximum budget, and another for how the adopted budget is funded. And we have an interactive tool. I think we're going over the tools in a lunch and learn, I think end of October, maybe the 29th, if that's a Tuesday. So I'm not going to go over those today. We just don't have time, but I'll go over the district general fund, kind of one-page document here that shows how this formula works. So basically on, our first piece of the formula, we have the establishment of a base budget and a maximum budget. And so those two budgets are based on certain percentages of certain funding components, which I think is a little tricky. But basically, we have 5 fully state funded components, and in both formulas, each district is going to get 100% of those state funded components. Next, we have special education. And in order to build the base budget, we give a district 140% of their special education payment. Again, this is just to establish the limit. They're not actually getting funded at that level. And then they're getting 80% of their basic and per A and B entitlements. For the maximum budget, they get 100% of the state funded components, up to 200% of the special education component, and 100% of the basic and per A and B entitlements. But again, we don't fund them at that level. So these just establish the lines on the bucket to say this is where your budget has to be. There are a few exceptions that allow school districts to go over their maximum budget, and that's generally due to declining enrollment when they have that 3-year averaging of A and B that kind of provides that soft landing. But basically, once we've drawn the lines on the bucket, then we can start to fill the bucket with funding. So again, they get 100% of the fully state funded components. They get 100% of special education and 44.7% of the basic and per A and B entitlements. And so that's where the delta between the amount of actual state funding and the base budget occurs. And so that is what we call our GTB area. Basically, this area that's left over between the amount of state funding that's filled up and the base budget. And there are multiple ways school districts can fill this area. Some school districts have a bunch of non-levy revenue from oil and gas or coal. Some districts have some fund balance reappropriated from the prior year that they can roll over to the current year. And then primarily the rest of this area is filled with either property taxes or GTB. In fact, generally a combination of both. Usually your taxable value wealthy districts will fill this area entirely with property tax. The taxable value poor districts will have a combination, and that's because GTB is a per mill subsidy. So there are 0 cases where GTB fills this entire area without a property tax component. There's always a property tax component there, even if it's small. And so what that kind of zippered line is showing is that depending on the property tax or the taxable value makeup of the district, that percentage of GTB funding and property tax can change. And once districts get to that base budget, which again, the GTB will fill them up to that base budget if they don't have the taxable value wealth, everything over base is not funded by the state. So in order to reach the maximum budget, school districts either have to fill that area with tuition, other non-levy revenue, or an over base levy, which is really a voted levy that the local taxpayers approve. And so statewide, we're funded at about 97% of max. Certain districts are funded at base, certain districts are funded at max or a little bit over, and certain districts are funded in between. But on a statewide average, we're at about 97%. And so I think, a lot of times I get asked, well, where do the 95 mills show up? really the 95 mills and the remainder of the state general fund that's coming from income tax are funding those three green components and GTB. We don't say that the 95 mills go to GTB or the 95 mills go to direct state aid. It's all one pot of money coming from the state that then goes to the state components, which again, there are four of them.
Mhm.
And then again, when we look at our property taxes, to get up to base, we really have a required levy. That's not optional for voters or for districts. But in the over base area, that is a voted levy. And so I think that can be a little bit confusing in the general fund sometimes because often funds are either they have permissive mills or they have voted mills, and often it's not a combination of both. And so that's where we get into some other funds. So we have the district general fund that we've talked about, which is used for basic instructional and operational costs of districts. It pays salaries, keeps the lights on, funds some instructional materials, etc. And then we have 9 other funds. We have a retirement fund, which funds certain retirement costs for the district contributions to the retirement systems. The systems actually pay out the benefits, not the schools. This has a countywide levy, but also receives some state retirement GTB support. Again, that amount will be increased with House Bill 587. We have the debt service fund. This is a fund that only has voted levies. It's used to pay off debt from selling bonds, usually for major construction projects. There is a state debt service assistance, which is kind of GTB-like, which again is affected by House Bill 587, but down the line. We have a transportation fund, which transports kids to and from school, doesn't pay for extracurricular activities or field trips or anything like that, but it's just the specific to and from school transportation costs. That's a permissive levy, so it does not have to be voted on by the voters in order to take effect. We have the building reserve fund. This is kind of another fund with a blend of permissive and voted levies, which is used for school major maintenance projects. And it also has a GTB-like mechanism, which is state major maintenance aid. That's also going to be affected down the line by the House Bill 587 mechanism in the SEPTA account. We have a bus depreciation fund, which accumulates funds for bus replacement or additional school buses. That's a permissive district levy. A flexibility fund, which has a bunch of different uses. Curriculum development is one of the ones that comes to mind. But it's funded in kind of a unusual way. There's some transfers, grants, and there's a very limited district levy, which is permissive, that can supplement transformational learning aid. Then we have the technology fund. This is a voted levy at the district level, and there is a small state tech payment. I think it's about $1 million per year for the entire state. So it's generally a relatively small amount per district, but it's used to purchase and maintain technology equipment. We have a tuition fund, which again is a permissive levy, but it pays tuition for students who are attending a school district outside their district of residence. So the way that it works is that the tuition fund collects property tax levies from the district of residence, and then it pays the tuition payments into the school district general fund of the receiving district. So that's why you see tuition showing up in the general fund formula as well. Those are the payments that are received from other districts. And finally, we have the adult education fund, which is a relatively small fund, but it's used for students 16 years of age or older who are not regularly enrolled. This is also a permissive district levy. And so here we have a chart that shows kind of the funding or the revenue breakdown for all these different funds. Some of the smaller ones are combined into all other budgeted funds just because it gets to be too many to show all at once. But the biggest funds, of course, are the district general fund, the county retirement fund, building reserve, debt service, and transportation. And so you can see the different funding components in the district general fund here, and then also in the other funds. And I think kind of one of the important things to point out here is that property taxes are a component of all of these funds. Sometimes they're required levies, sometimes they're voted, sometimes they're non-voted. But in general, they're not the entirety of the funding for any individual fund. There are almost always some other funding sources like non-levy revenue, fund balance reappropriated, sometimes state general fund, etc. And so this leads us to discussing some variation in property tax levies for K-12 education. We have, these mills levied by the state, by the counties, by the local school districts, some of them being required, some are voted, some non-voted, and it leads to, a lot of variation across the state, especially at the district level. So at the state level, of course, everyone's paying 95 mills. But at the countywide level, they're even for retirement and transportation costs, which are very formulaic, we have some very different numbers of mills being levied. These are as of fiscal year 2019, but the mill numbers might change a little bit, but they're not all that different than what we have today in terms of variation. I will point out we have a lot of white on this map, and I often get asked what it is, and those are non-taxable lands. So you can see the kind of federal forest lands, tribal reservations, state trust lands, and actually the checkerboard you can see in a lot of these counties that's especially visible in the eastern half of the state. Those are our common school trust lands. I think it's like the 16th and 36th parcel in each county or something along those lines. But that's what those checkerboards are, our common state state trust lands that are dedicated to school funding.
Okay.
So we have some sources of variation here that we've identified. We have differences in taxable value. We have differences in costs of providing services. And so I'll walk through a few examples of those. We've got Gallatin County and Madison County, which if you see on the chart or on the map here, Gallatin County is in yellow around the 40 mil amount, and Madison County is dark blue. And so when we look at the two different amounts of countywide school mills, we have 41 in Gallatin County and about 9 in Madison County. And that is just a difference in tax base per student. If we look at the total taxable value and the total A and B, again, a proxy for enrollment in Gallatin County, we have about $25,000 of taxable value per student. In Madison County, when we look at those numbers, it's about $158,000 per student. And so with a differing tax base, Gallatin County needs to levy a lot more mills in order to raise the same amount of revenue per A and B or per student.
Mm-hmm.
We also have non-levy revenue differences. So we're taking a look here at Macomb County and Richland County. Richland is levying 0 countywide school mills. Macomb is levying 43. And so the takeaway here, I mean, I've got some stats there, but the takeaway is really that when we combine property tax and non-levy revenue, we get a more full picture. So if we just looked at the property tax component, we'd have about $1,300 or $1,400 in countywide property taxes per kid in Macomb County and 0 in Richland County, which looks like there's a disparity between the two. But when you add in the non-levy revenue, which again is only about $14 per kid in Macomb County versus $1,100 per kid in Richland County, you can see that the numbers are a lot more comparable, 1,100 to about 1,400. Between the two counties, but that's only because Richland County has a lot of non-levy revenue that they're leaning on, which is allowing them to avoid levying property taxes for their residents. And then the final source of variation we have at the county level is the cost of providing services. If you take a look at Garfield County, which is a more rural county, versus Yellowstone County, which is a little bit smaller and more urban, Garfield is levying about 77 countywide school mills versus 43 in Yellowstone County. And when it really comes down to it, it's just that busing kids across a more rural county versus a smaller, more urban county, the costs of that are different. And so it just is costing about $1,500 per student in Garfield County and about $900 per student in Yellowstone County. And so we have the same kind of sources of variation at the local level. Only here, instead of having 56 different counties, we have 400 different school districts. And in order to make the 400 school districts comparable, we've overlapped the elementary and high school districts so that when we compare them to K-12 districts, the numbers of mills are more comparable. But again, you can see we've got some very different numbers of mills. You've got school districts levying 0 mills and school districts levying between 600 and 800 mills. And so most of these mills go to the district general fund, but that's not one of the bigger sources of variation because, of course, you have a very formulaic allowed amount in the district general fund. You have a base amount, you have a maximum amount. You don't see a ton of variation there. So the variation that you're seeing is from different funds like the building reserve fund or the debt service fund or the tuition fund. And so not only do we have the same sources of variation we had at the county level, but we also add in another source of variation, which is local decisions. And so we actually have a brand new analyst with our office. Well, her name is Alexandra. She started in June.
Yes.
And so she is going to be taking a closer look at school facilities. It's something we haven't really done a ton of work on yet, but since she's getting used to presenting on school facilities, and this is going to be kind of her topic, I was going to let her talk about this slide because I think it's one of our last slides.
Hi, Representative Barker. My name is Alexandra Ghosh.
Nice to meet you, Alexander.
Nice to
Welcome.
meet you. Thank you. And bear with me as I'm still getting my feet wet with school funding. But this slide in particular, we're looking at kind of a tale of two districts, East Helena and then Jefferson County. And what we're seeing here is that it's the prerogative of a district, if they wish, for example, to build a new school, which will alter these numbers per child. So even though it costs approximately $1,400 per student to keep the lights on, pay teacher salaries, etc., East Helena took the decision to build a new school, in which case that raises that per A and B value to $4,663. So they voted on that. It doesn't change the cost per child to send them to school. What we're looking at here, though, is that cost per child is servicing that debt to pay for that school. Thank you. So obviously you can see at the bottom here, there's no voted mills in Jefferson County because they did not decide to service any debt and build new schools, whereas East Helena did take that decision on. So like I said, it's the prerogative of a district if they choose to do those things, which can maybe look like a disparity, but at the end of the day, it's still roughly the same cost, even in different taxable value districts. So you can see on that second line, the taxable value in Jefferson is half, a little less than half of the taxable value of East Helena. So that's what's driving these differences in numbers is that decision to build a new school. And hopefully I explained that all right for you.
Yes, that's good. Well, it's interesting too that not only is the taxable value about half, but and I know that's not normally the case, but the A and B is about half as well.
Yep.
And these examples were chosen to really kind of like eliminate some of the kind of confounding variables. There are definitely districts that have a number of different, not only do they have taxable value differences, they have different local decisions, they have different costs of services. And so these were attempts to kind of isolate those effects in order to illustrate them for the legislature. I know this has been a pretty dense presentation. There's a lot to go through. K-12 funding in Montana can be pretty complicated, but we have a number of resources. We have a couple of brochures, one on the district general fund and one on the guarantee account. There are screenshots of both of those in this presentation. And then they're a little bit older now, but Pat McCracken with the Legislative Services Division put together a number of different story maps. Conceptually, I think they very much hold true. The numbers might be a little old and legislation like House Bill 587 hasn't been updated in these story maps, but they're still really useful, I think, if you're trying to understand some of the different funds more in depth. And then we also have a property tax library, a school funding library on the website that we put together for the leg days in June. And then the LFD interactive tools, which we've got one for property taxes, one for the school district general fund and other funds, and then a couple of maps that show different school mills and some school enrollment revenue and expenditure trends that we did as part of the MARA project 2 years ago. So there are a lot of resources to look into if you're interested. And of course, you're more than welcome to reach out to us to discuss them, because I know there's a lot there. But I think with that, if you have any questions, we're happy to go back through and talk about some of the slides if you'd like to go more in depth on any of them.